Hello and welcome to Missions and Missiology and a new aspect that we're going to highlight today, another mega trend in missions in the 21st century, which is the importance of marketplace ministry or also business as mission. These are related topics. Sometimes we only talk about one, we only focus on professionals in missions. Sometimes people only talk about business as mission. Here in this video, I'm going to combine those two because in both of those models, people are generating income through their work, different from the traditional missionary model where people raise support in their home country typically and then go overseas to serve somewhere else. And not only do people raise income, but there's also a particular emphasis on the work that they are doing. And there's a lot of talk about that recently, and over the years, many books about this topic have been published. So here is one example by Larry Sharp, the book Missions Disrupted, and then subtitled From Professional Missionaries to Missional Professionals. Obviously, a play on word there. And again, the first line from professional missionaries, that is the traditional model. And then the author is pointing out is that what we really want to get at is that we have missional professionals, so that we have professionals working in different fields, whether that's in our own country or in another country or in a different culture, that are very intentional about the way they live and the way they live out their faith in the marketplace, in their workplace. And then we have this book on business as mission concepts and stories. We've got the BAM global movement. So business as mission is often abbreviated as BAM. And the authors here are Guy Gord and Matt Thunhag. And again, there's many other publications that have been published on these kind of topics. So for us, of course, we want to talk about biblical foundations. That's always something we want to look at when we think about or evaluate a trend in missions. And then I want to give some examples of marketplace ministry, which again would include both professionals and business as mission. And then I also want to highlight some challenges and opportunities. So with that, we'll start with biblical foundations. Um, Biblical foundations in missions. So first of all, yes, we do want to recognize, and a lot of people like to highlight that Paul, at least at times, worked as a tent maker. That's something that is directly highlighted in Acts chapter 2, Acts chapter 18, verses 2 and 3. And then there are several examples where in his letters to the churches that he founded, or also maybe the churches that he wants to visit, um, he emphasizes how he worked with his own hands, that he didn't want to be a burden to others, that he wanted to set an example through hard work. And it's sometimes not directly said what kind of work that was that he was doing. But again, in combination with this passage in Acts chapter 18, it does look like he was doing manual work, physical work, something that he was skilled in, and that his preaching and teaching and evangelizing and discipling came on top of that. Now, when it comes to the identity that Paul had, how he saw himself and how he presented himself and how he introduced himself to others, we have to acknowledge, though, that he did not introduce himself as a tent maker, right? Paul, for the people that he was ministering to, and also for us today, is not known as a tent maker in the not in the same way that maybe somebody who is a professional today, like a lawyer or a teacher or a software engineer, would introduce themselves in that way, right? It's a typical question that we ask in social settings, what do you do for a living? And then people say what they do for a living. They describe their job, what they do full time, where they spend most of the time and energy in. Now, with Paul, to me, it seems like that yes, sometimes he was working with his own hands, but at other times he was also receiving funding from churches, and he describes in his letters how the ministers of the gospel have a right to be supported by their churches. That there's many biblical principles that advocate for that. And interestingly, in his letters, like for example in Romans chapter 1, verse 1, but also in many other places, he introduces himself as an apostle, right? And an apostle of Jesus Christ, somebody who has been commissioned to proclaim the faith among the Gentiles, among the nations, to do pioneer church planting work. That it seems like that was his identity. That's how he saw himself. That was his sense of calling. And so I think that the term tent making, or that somebody works as a tent maker for that reason, it can be a little bit misleading. That maybe somebody for example, who works as an English teacher in China, and that's their main vocation, and that's where they spend most of their time and energy in, is not quite the same as Paul making or fixing tents in order to make ends meet. So the bigger picture is that work is part of God's original purpose for people, which is something we see in Genesis chapter 1, where God creates men and women in his image, and in a way, because they are created in his image, they become his representatives. They are commissioned with taking dominion over the plants and the animals. And then in chapter 2, we see that God, before the fall, specifically commissions Adam to work in the Garden of Eden. And so I think the big picture is that work, whether it's a physical work or in our day and age, it's often relational work, networking, some kind of networking, or mental work, right? Research, design, jobs like that those can be done for God's glory in intentional ways. That yet not only can we be a witness, of course, in the work settings that God places us in, but the work in itself can have redemptive qualities, can be part of God's kingdom purposes on earth. And I think that's one reason why people are excited about marketplace ministry and business as mission. So speaking of that, what are some of the examples when we talk about people being in the marketplace? So one is business as mission, right, with the abbreviation BAM, and a typical endeavor that churches or organizations get involved in are coffee shops. I witnessed that, for example, in Shanghai. I once went to a large Korean church, and they had a coffee shop, and the kind of coffee shop that would not only serve people in the church, but they were also selling coffee, and people from outside the church could also go there um, and get some. But that was directly at the church building, though. So it was not like an independent enterprise. But some missionaries, including workers that we have within World Team, the agency I work for, they have started coffee shops in different parts of the world as a way of, again, being a blessing to the people that they serve, to employ people, to give them a job, but also to create a platform where evangelism and discipleship can take place. Similar with ice cream parlors, I once met a young couple from YWAM Youth with a Mission who had a vision to start a ice cream parlor, or maybe like a bakery kind of thing where they would also sell ice cream. And I think they were looking at a remote part in China where they wanted to do that. We've got small workshops sometimes where people can produce items like jewelry or keychains, and sometimes those are then sold in the West, maybe through the internet, and create some income that way. Theoretically, business as mission could also be a large company like a manufacturing facility, but in my understanding, opening a bakery or a coffee shop or a small workshop is really quite different from establishing a whole factory where you need millions or maybe even tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. Um, I'm just calling this here foreign invested companies, which of course also happens in the secular world a lot, that companies decide to make a foreign investment in another country, which could then be a wholly foreign owned enterprise, could be a joint venture, whatever the legal form that people are choosing, you have a presence, you have a sizable investment in that other country, and you're also employing a larger number of people. And sometimes there are Christians. I heard of a group of Christians, for example, in Singapore that were doing that in mainland China that are intentional about starting those companies. So it could be a manufacturing facility, it could be more like an office, right? If like an IT consulting company or a software development company, things like that. Then another category would be where you don't have an entire entity, but you just have individuals, right? So you have professionals in mission. So you have engineers, nurses, teachers, etc., working in paid positions. Of course, even in the traditional model for missions agency, we often have engineers, nurses, and teachers who raise support, for example, here in the United States, and then go overseas and serve at a clinic, let's say, as nurses and doctors where they are not receiving a salary or maybe just receiving a small stipend for their work, and their main income comes from the United States. So that would be a traditional missionary model where somebody serves primarily with their professional capacity. Here we have professionals who are full-time employed, not necessarily by an agency, but by a company overseas, like, might be a very large one, like a Fortune 500 company, could be a smaller one, could be a hospital, right? Like a state-owned hospital in a country, for example, in the Middle East that employs nurses and teachers, nurses and doctors. Of course, the majority of them being locals, let's say in the hospital in Saudi Arabia, would primarily employ Saudi Arabian nurses and doctors, but maybe they also employ some foreign doctors and nurses, and among those might be Christians who accept that job or maybe apply for that job in the first place with a very missional intention. Same with teachers. Of course, in missions, there have always been a lot of teachers. Starting schools has been something that a lot of missionaries have done over the centuries, and even in some instances, starting colleges and universities. Here again, the idea would be that somebody's a teacher or a professor that is employed by a school in another country. Could be a Christian school, but may also be a private school, maybe a private school for expats and their children and the children of diplomats. Could be a public school in another country. Again, the point is here that they would be working in paid positions. And then we also have migrant workers, which of course are also working in paid positions, but I'm putting them in an extra category here because they might be people like construction workers, maids, nannies that don't have high qualifications, that don't necessarily look for a career overseas. They are really looking for a job, uh, and they might have a missional intention, but oftentimes they are primarily driven by economic needs. And that's also a phenomenon that we see in missions, that migration, moving to another country, sometimes happens voluntarily and sometimes happens involuntarily, in the sense that economic conditions in one's home country may be so bad that people are, in a way, forced to look for work somewhere else in order to earn a living and to feed their families. And an example for that, where that often happens with a very intentional Christian missionary attitude that accompanies that work or passion, are Filipino maids. There's a lot of economic needs in the Philippines, and for that reason, there are a lot of Filipinos and Filipinas who are looking for work overseas. Could be in Hong Kong, for example, to work as a maid in Hong Kong, to work in the Middle East as a nanny, and oftentimes, especially in the Middle East, that means that those Filipinas who are Christians are in a Muslim environment where there are very few Christians, and God may be able to use that to spread His kingdom and to spread the gospel, and maybe churches will be planted, and there's many things that can happen that maybe we don't read about in our missions journals necessarily or in the updates that we are getting, but that is part of how the gospel is spreading in our day and age. Um, so, many different ways of being in a paid position of some kind in another country. Now, there's challenges and opportunities that go along with that. Um, so, so on the challenges side, starting a business overseas or finding a job overseas are difficult endeavors. Yeah. So, raising support in your home country and then going as a missionary is not easy, but finding a job overseas isn't easy either. And starting a company can be very difficult already in your own country. Statistically, most companies that are founded, most entrepreneurial activities fail in the first 2 years. So, or I'm not sure if it's most, but it's a high percentage that fail. And so, part of the challenge, of course, is that one needs capital to start a business, and then the question is where will that capital come from? Another common challenge is time management, the whole idea of balancing work and ministry. Of course, with the grand overall vision of Genesis chapters 1 and 2 that we mentioned, the work in itself can be seen as ministry. But let's say somebody works as a software engineer for a Fortune 500 company, uh, let's say in an office in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, and they work 10, 12 hours a day. And on top of that, their passion and their vision is to share the gospel with people in Malaysia, with Muslims in Kuala Lumpur, and to start a house church that then hopefully will also become a church. And there's a lot of time and energy that needs to go into that as well, into that kind of, let's say, traditional ministry. And that can be something that can be difficult to balance. Also, language learning in an expat environment may be less of a priority. So, oftentimes in traditional mission agencies with traditional missionaries, there's a heavy emphasis on becoming fluent in the language of that country. So, oftentimes, missionaries even have to learn two languages. So, they first learn the national language or the trade language, and then they learn the language of a particular tribe or ethnic group or people group that needs the gospel, maybe also needs the Bible in their language. So then that would then be followed by a Bible translation project. And to become fluent in the language, you usually have to be a full-time student, immersed in the language, living in the country, only doing language like for 2 years or so. And then after that, you still need to keep working on your language. And oftentimes, when you're sent overseas for a company, you might get a language class or something. You might do something on the weekends or so. But oftentimes, those international companies operate in English or in the country of the origin. Let's say you work for a Japanese company, then a lot of the communication within the company would be in the Japanese language. And then you don't necessarily have the pressure, and you also don't have the time and the energy to become fluent in the language of the country where you're working. And another challenge, of course, can be to lose focus, and that maybe there's a lack of focus in this whole endeavor. Maybe for some people, they have a missional intention when they apply for this job and go overseas, but over time it just becomes a career move, and so then the whole vision of reaching the unreached is being lost. Having said that, there's also many opportunities that come with these kind of marketplace or business mission assignments, and that's one reason why so many people are talking about it nowadays, and why so many articles and books are being published on this topic, because there is a lot of advantages that come with it, and one of them, one opportunity or one advantage, is that uh, being in a work environment leads to credibility. That credibility helps you to live in that country long term and to connect with people in meaningful ways, because it helps you to answer the question, oh, you're from the United States, for example, or you are from the Philippines. What are you doing here? Why are you here? Why are you interested in our culture and our language? Those questions will come, and being in a work environment rather than with a traditional missions agency can help you answer that question. Then a big issue in global missions, more and more, is obtaining a visa. Again, when you go with a traditional mission agency, at first you might be on a student visa because you're full-time learning the language in that country. But then, what's the long-term plan to obtain a visa? Some countries still do have missionary visas. For example, many African countries do have that, but others don't. And some countries are also more or less hostile towards missionaries and Christian workers and are suspicious. And the government may grant a family, for example, a visa for some time, and then they become suspicious and are like, these people, I'm not sure what they're up to. They might be Christians, they might be evangelizing. We're not going to give them a visa anymore. They have to leave the country. When you are employed by a company, they usually will sponsor the visa for you. If you are investing in a business and you can apply for a business visa, you may not have those kind of issues. Also, like we said, raising support is not easy. There's strong biblical foundation for it. So I'm not arguing that there's only one way forward in missions. I do believe that there's still a place for traditional missionaries. But being a traditional missionary sometimes can be really challenging from a financial point of view. And then if you are employed by a company or have your own business, that would give you a stable income and potentially good benefits and, like health insurance, and pension, those kind of things. And so that can be very attractive. But again, there is no easy path because finding that kind of job that gives you a stable income and good benefits is not going to be easy. And then, of course, a massive benefit, and that's very important from a Kingdom of God perspective, is that professionals and business people have the ability to become a blessing to others through their work. It could be through their work directly, through the particular skill that they have. It could be because they are creating employment for others, just the relationships that are happening in a work environment, the evangelism, the discipleship that can happen there in a natural way. Those are all major benefits and major opportunities for the gospel. And with that, I want to thank you for your attention, for your interest in this topic. I look forward to engaging with you. Leave your thoughts in the comments if you want to share anything about your thoughts on marketplace ministry, your thoughts on business as mission, your thoughts on traditional missionary service, and I look forward to reading those. Um, and with that, we're done for today. I'm gonna stop sharing and also stop this video. And until next time, God bless.